Everyone gets the strategy half right. Silence, distance, going quiet after loving someone who couldn't quite love back the way it deserved to be received. All of that genuinely disrupts an avoidant's internal equilibrium, and there's real psychology behind why. But silence, powerful as it is, still leaves an avoidant something to hold on to, something to interpret, something that quietly reassures them that they still matter enough to have caused an effect. There's one thing that removes even that, one thing that doesn't just disrupt an avoidant's equilibrium, but actually threatens the story their entire identity has been built around. And it isn't anger, and it isn't distance, and it isn't a clever line delivered at exactly the right moment. It's something far quieter, far harder to fake, and far more devastating precisely because it can't be performed convincingly if it isn't real. What follows is an explanation of why genuine, visible peace, actual contentment that exists independently of whether an avoidant ever comes back, tends to land with a force that silence alone never quite manages to reach. This isn't a manipulation tactic disguised as healing advice. It's an explanation of a specific psychological mechanism, one that reveals something important about what avoidants actually fear most, and why that fear has almost nothing to do with losing a person, and almost everything to do with what losing that person threatens to reveal about themselves. Anyone listening who has already tried silence, who went quiet, stopped reaching, waited, and still felt that nagging uncertainty about whether any of it actually registered, deserves to understand why silence alone sometimes isn't enough, and what actually completes the picture in a way that finally, permanently settles the question of whether it mattered. It's worth naming, briefly, why so much popular advice about handling avoidant partners stops at silence and treats it as the end point of the entire process. Because understanding this gap helps explain why so many people follow that advice diligently and still end up feeling unsatisfied by the results. Silence is easier to describe as a strategy, easier to package into a simple, actionable instruction. Stop responding, create distance, wait it out. Genuine peace resists this kind of simple packaging because it can't be reduced to a specific action taken at a specific time. It's a state of being that develops gradually through an entire process of internal rebuilding. And that resistance to simple packaging is likely exactly why it gets discussed so much less often, despite being, as this entire exploration has argued, considerably more psychologically significant than silence on its own. To understand why peace lands so differently than silence, it helps to first understand what silence actually communicates to an avoidant, because it's rarely as simple as absence. Silence, even prolonged, complete silence, still carries an emotional charge that an avoidant's mind can interpret in a specific, familiar way. It signals hurt. It signals that something significant occurred, that the person choosing silence is dealing with pain serious enough to warrant withdrawing entirely. This interpretation, uncomfortable as it might be for the avoidant to sit with, still offers something their psychology can work with. Evidence that they mattered enough to cause that pain. Confirmation, however unwelcome, that their presence in someone else's life left a mark significant enough to require this kind of drastic response. This is a subtle but crucial point because it explains something that confuses a lot of people who use silence as a strategy and then feel disappointed when it doesn't produce the transformation they were hoping for. Silence disrupts an avoidant's usual rhythm, and it often does trigger exactly the kind of panic, urgency, and eventual reckoning described in other explorations of this topic. But silence alone doesn't necessarily threaten an avoidant's deeper, more protected self-concept, because silence can still be filed away, however painfully, as evidence of significance. Being missed, even through the evidence of someone else's visible suffering, still centers the avoidant as someone important enough to cause that suffering. There's a strange, backwards comfort available in that, even amid genuine panic and discomfort. Genuine, visible peace works completely differently, and understanding why requires looking directly at the specific fear sitting underneath almost all avoidant behavior. a fear that rarely gets named clearly enough in most conversations about this attachment style. Avoidants are usually described as afraid of closeness, afraid of vulnerability, afraid of being trapped or engulfed by another person's needs. All of this is true, but underneath these more commonly discussed fears sits something even more fundamental: a quiet, persistent terror of being fundamentally unnecessary, replaceable, forgettable, someone whose absence changes nothing at all in the lives of people who once claimed to love them. This fear rarely gets acknowledged directly, even by the avoidant experiencing it, because acknowledging it would require admitting a need for significance that contradicts their entire self-concept of independence and self-sufficiency. But it operates powerfully beneath the surface, shaping behaviour in ways that are easy to misread if this fear isn't understood clearly. And this is exactly the fear that genuine peace, rather than silence, activates most directly and most devastatingly. Consider what it actually communicates when someone an avoidant once loved, once pushed away, once took for granted through countless small withdrawals and inconsistencies, is later observed to be genuinely, authentically at peace, not performing wellness, not pretending to have moved on while secretly waiting for a reconciliation, but actually demonstrably content, building a full life that clearly doesn't require the avoidant's presence or validation to feel complete. It's worth pausing on that word, demonstrably, because it carries real weight in this explanation. This isn't peace that requires anyone to be told about it directly, or peace that depends on some deliberate act of communication back to the avoidant, confirming that everything turned out fine. It's peace visible simply through the ordinary texture of someone's life, how they carry themselves, what they talk about, what clearly occupies their attention and energy now. All of it observable, if the avoidant ever happens to observe it at all, without requiring any specific message or gesture designed to make sure they do. This ambient, unforced visibility is part of what makes it so different from every other tactic already discussed, since it doesn't rely on delivery or timing the way a pointed confrontation or a strategically shared update might. This doesn't confirm significance the way silence does. It threatens to confirm the opposite, that whatever damage the avoidant assumed they caused, whatever lasting mark they assumed their presence left, simply isn't as permanent or as central as their own fear-driven narrative always assumed it would be. This is where the psychological mechanism becomes genuinely fascinating, because it inverts something most people assume about how avoidants process loss. The common assumption is that avoidants want to believe an ex has moved on easily, because that belief supports their own preference for minimizing emotional significance and avoiding accountability for how the relationship ended. But this assumption misses something crucial. While part of an avoidant might consciously prefer to believe an ex is doing fine, since that belief absolves them of guilt, a much deeper, less conscious part of their psychology actually needs to believe their absence caused some lasting disruption, because that disruption is the only available evidence, in the absence of genuine, ongoing intimacy, that they were ever significant at all. This creates a genuine internal conflict for an avoidant, confronted with authentic peace, rather than the ambiguous silence they were braced for. Part of them wants to feel relieved, absolved, free of guilt. But a deeper, more vulnerable part experiences something closer to quiet devastation, the unwelcome confirmation that their absence, rather than leaving the kind of permanent void their fear-driven imagination always assumed it would, simply became one more chapter in someone else's life, integrated, processed, and ultimately, genuinely moved past. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Imagine someone who has spent their entire life believing that removing a single support beam from a large, complex structure would cause the entire building to collapse. A belief so deeply held that they've never actually tested it, simply assumed its truth based on old, unexamined fears about their own significance and importance. Now imagine watching that beam finally removed, and instead of collapse, the structure adjusts, redistributes its weight elsewhere, and continues standing, sturdy, functional, arguably even more balanced than before. This isn't a comforting sight for someone who built their entire identity around believing they were load-bearing, indispensable, impossible to remove without causing catastrophic damage. It's a genuinely unsettling one, forcing a confrontation with the possibility that their significance was never quite as structural as their fear had always insisted it was. This is precisely the confrontation genuine peace creates for an avoidant, one that silence, however prolonged, never quite manages to trigger in the same way. Because silence, again, can always be interpreted as evidence of ongoing structural importance, evidence that the removal did, in fact, cause the collapse their fear predicted, simply a slower, quieter collapse than expected. Peace removes even that reassurance entirely. It helps to trace this fear back further, because understanding its origin clarifies why it operates with such force, and why it responds so specifically to genuine peace, rather than to anger or distance. This fear of being fundamentally unnecessary rarely originates within the relationship being discussed here. It tends to form much earlier, often in childhood, frequently in an environment where a child's presence or absence didn't seem to register as particularly significant to the adults responsible for them. Where needs went unnoticed, often enough that the child eventually concluded, usually without ever consciously articulating it, that their own significance in other people's lives couldn't be assumed or relied upon. This early conclusion doesn't disappear in adulthood. It becomes a kind of background operating assumption, quietly shaping how a person interprets ambiguous signals throughout every subsequent relationship they enter. For someone carrying this assumption, evidence of impact, someone else's visible pain, someone else's ongoing preoccupation, someone else's silence interpreted as grief, becomes a kind of reassurance against an old, deeply held fear that was never really about any particular partner at all. It was always about proving, again and again, in whatever relationship happened to be available, that this time, unlike whatever happened earlier in life, their presence actually mattered enough to leave a lasting mark. This explains why avoidants often unconsciously create the very dynamics that eventually produce painful endings, prolonged inconsistency, repeated distancing, behaviour that tests a partner's patience again and again. Each test, whether consciously intended this way or not, offers another opportunity to gather evidence about their own significance, another data point confirming or denying the old fear that they might simply be unnecessary to the people who claim to love them. A partner's continued patience, continued effort, continued willingness to interpret difficult behaviour generously, all of this becomes, however painfully, confirmation that the avoidant's presence still matters enough to be worth this kind of ongoing accommodation. This is precisely why the ending of the relationship, and particularly the specific texture of that ending, silence versus anger versus genuine peace, carries so much psychological weight for an avoidant, far beyond what the relationship's day-to-day dynamics alone might suggest. The ending becomes the final, most significant piece of evidence in a lifelong, largely unconscious investigation into whether this person, in this specific relationship, finally represents an exception to that old, deeply held fear of being fundamentally unnecessary. Genuine peace, precisely because it offers such unambiguous evidence against that hoped-for exception, tends to land with a weight that other, more relationally entangled reactions simply don't carry in the same way. It's important here to draw a clear and necessary distinction, because this entire explanation could easily be misread as encouragement to perform peace strategically, to fake contentment as a manipulation tactic designed to produce a specific reaction in someone else. This would be a serious misunderstanding of everything being described here, and it's worth addressing directly and firmly. Performed peace doesn't produce this effect. Only genuine peace does. And the reason for this distinction matters enormously, both ethically and practically. Avoidants, despite their reputation for emotional obliviousness, are often remarkably attuned to inauthenticity, particularly regarding emotional performance, precisely because they've spent so much of their own life managing carefully curated emotional presentations designed to control how others perceive them. This means an avoidant is often unusually well equipped to detect performed contentment, subtle inconsistencies, and underlying tension or neediness that leaks through despite someone's best efforts to appear unaffected. Performed peace, rather than producing the destabilizing effect being described throughout this exploration, often produces something closer to relief for an avoidant. Confirmation that the old dynamic, someone performing wellness while secretly still centered on the avoidant's attention and validation, remains intact and unchanged. Genuine peace works entirely differently because it isn't performed for anyone's benefit, including the avoidant's. It exists independently of whether the avoidant ever witnesses it, ever hears about it, ever has any opportunity to interpret or react to it at all. This distinction is what gives it its unique psychological power. An avoidant confronted with genuine peace isn't confronting a strategy designed to affect them. They're confronting evidence that someone has built a complete, meaningful life that never actually depended on their presence in the way their own fear-driven narrative always assumed it would. A life that continues, fully and authentically, regardless of whether the avoidant is watching, reacting, or even aware of it at all. This raises an important, practical question worth addressing directly. How does someone actually develop this kind of genuine peace, rather than simply performing it while secretly still centered on an avoidant's eventual reaction? This isn't a simple switch to flip, and it isn't something that can be manufactured quickly through willpower alone. Genuine peace tends to develop through a specific, gradual process, one that has almost nothing to do with the avoidant at all, and everything to do with rebuilding a sense of identity and worth that never depended on being chosen, validated, or missed by anyone in the first place. This process typically begins with a genuine reckoning with whatever unmet needs the relationship with the avoidant may have been unconsciously attempting to address. Many people find themselves drawn repeatedly into relationships with emotionally unavailable partners, not by accident, but because some earlier experience, often long before this particular relationship began, established a pattern where love felt safest or most familiar when it required effort, patience, and a certain degree of chasing to obtain. Recognizing this pattern, without judgment, simply as an honest acknowledgement of one's own relational history, tends to be an essential early step toward building the kind of peace that doesn't depend on an avoidant's eventual reaction or return. From there, genuine peace tends to develop through consistent, deliberate attention to building a life rich enough in its own right that it doesn't require external validation to feel meaningful. This isn't about performative self-improvement designed to make an ex jealous or regretful. It's about genuinely reinvesting energy that used to flow entirely toward managing and interpreting someone else's inconsistency, redirecting that same energy toward relationships, activities, and personal growth that exist entirely independent of anyone else's attention or approval. This process takes real time, often considerably longer than people expect or want it to take, and it rarely follows a clean, linear trajectory. There are usually setbacks, moments of renewed longing, temptations to check in or seek reassurance that the process is working. All of this is a normal part of genuine healing, and expecting a perfectly smooth, uninterrupted path toward peace tends to create unnecessary additional suffering on top of whatever difficulty already exists. There's something worth validating clearly here, for anyone listening who feels frustrated or impatient with how long genuine peace seems to be taking to develop. This impatience is understandable, particularly for anyone who has heard that peace is somehow more powerful than silence, and now feels pressure to manufacture it quickly in order to produce a specific effect. But peace pursued primarily as a strategy to affect someone else's psychology isn't actually peace at all. It's simply another form of performance, oriented outward rather than inward, and it tends to collapse under its own weight the moment the hoped-for reaction fails to materialize on the expected timeline. Real peace has to be built for its own sake, valued for what it offers directly to the person building it, regardless of whether an avoidant ever notices, reacts to, or is even aware of its existence at all. This is perhaps the most important point in this entire exploration, and it deserves to be stated as clearly and directly as possible. If genuine peace is pursued specifically as a tool for affecting an avoidant, it will almost certainly fail to produce the effect being described here, precisely because pursuing it for that purpose keeps a person's internal focus centered on the avoidant's eventual reaction, rather than genuinely centered on their own well-being. The paradox at the heart of this entire mechanism is that peace only produces this destabilizing effect on an avoidant when it's built without any concern for whether it produces that effect at all. The moment peace becomes strategic, it stops being genuine. And the moment it stops being genuine, it loses precisely the quality that made it so powerful in the first place. This means the healthiest and ultimately the only effective way to approach everything described throughout this exploration is to release entirely any expectation about how an avoidant might eventually respond to witnessing or learning about this peace. The goal was never to produce a particular reaction in someone else. The goal, all along, was to reclaim a sense of wholeness that never should have depended on someone else's validation or presence to begin with. Whatever effect that wholeness eventually has on an avoidant, whether it produces genuine reckoning, quiet indifference, or something else entirely, is ultimately beyond anyone's control, and, more importantly, beside the point. For anyone listening who has already begun this process, who has stopped waiting, stopped monitoring, stopped measuring their own progress against whatever reaction they imagine an avoidant might eventually have, there's something important worth acknowledging. This process, difficult as it clearly is, represents one of the most significant forms of self-respect available after loving someone who struggled to offer consistency and security in return. It doesn't require confirmation from the avoidant to be valid or complete. Its value exists entirely independently, in the life being built, in the worth being reclaimed, in the wholeness being developed that never should have been contingent on anyone else's attention in the first place. There's a cognitive dimension worth explaining here as well, because it helps clarify why genuine peace produces such a lasting, if quiet, impact, rather than simply fading quickly, the way acute reactions to silence sometimes do. Human minds are generally quite skilled at maintaining beliefs that feel threatened by contradictory evidence, through a range of well-documented mental shortcuts that allow uncomfortable information to be minimized, reframed, or dismissed entirely. An avoidant, confronted with a partner's visible anger or prolonged silence, has plenty of familiar cognitive tools available for managing that discomfort, telling themselves the anger will fade, the silence will eventually break, the relationship's significance was probably exaggerated by the other person's emotional intensity, rather than reflecting anything genuinely true about the avoidant's own importance. Genuine peace is considerably harder to reframe using these same tools, precisely because it doesn't present itself as an emotional reaction requiring interpretation or management at all. There's no intensity to dismiss, no urgency to wait out, no emotional charge to attribute to the other person's supposedly exaggerated feelings. It simply exists as a quiet, stable fact, someone's life continuing fully and authentically, without requiring any explanation or resolution regarding the avoidant's role within it. This absence of anything to actively manage or reframe is precisely why genuine peace tends to settle into an avoidant's awareness more permanently than more intense, more clearly emotional reactions often do. There's simply nothing available to argue against, minimize, or wait out. It just is what it is, indefinitely, regardless of how the avoidant chooses to interpret or respond to it. This also explains why the internal reckoning genuine peace tends to produce inside an avoidant often lasts considerably longer than the more acute, visible panic silence alone typically generates. Panic, being an intense emotional state, naturally tends to resolve over time as the nervous system recalibrates, whether through renewed contact, enough time passing, or the gradual construction of new coping mechanisms. The quiet unease genuine peace produces doesn't follow this same trajectory, because it isn't rooted primarily in emotional intensity that naturally fades. It's rooted in a cognitive recalibration regarding the avoidant's own significance, a recalibration that, once it settles in, tends to persist indefinitely as a background awareness, rather than resolving through the usual passage of time, the way acute panic often does. There's a further layer worth examining because it explains why this specific combination, genuine peace built without any strategic intent, tends to be so much harder for avoidants to process than any amount of anger, distance, or even silence directed at them. Anger and distance, while uncomfortable, remain relationally oriented. They're directed at the avoidant, about the avoidant, still fundamentally centered on the relationship that ended. Genuine peace is different because it isn't oriented toward the avoidant at all. It represents a complete redirection of attention and energy away from the relationship entirely, towards something the avoidant has no access to, no ability to influence, and, crucially, no role in whatsoever. This total absence of relational orientation is what makes genuine peace so uniquely difficult for an avoidant to process, because it removes them from the story completely, rather than simply changing their role within it. Anger, hurt, and even prolonged silence all still position the avoidant as a central figure in someone else's emotional experience, whether as villain, source of pain, or object of ongoing preoccupation. Genuine peace removes them from the narrative altogether, and for someone whose deepest fear, as already discussed, involves being fundamentally unnecessary and forgettable, complete removal from someone else's story is a far more direct confrontation with that fear than any amount of continued emotional entanglement, however painful, could ever produce. It's worth naming something important here about timing and sequence, because it explains why silence and peace often need to work together, rather than as competing alternatives, despite this exploration's emphasis on peace as ultimately more powerful. Silence typically has to come first, not as a strategy designed to produce panic, but simply as a natural, necessary step in disengaging from a dynamic that required constant attention and management. It's very difficult to build genuine peace while still actively communicating with someone whose inconsistency continues to demand interpretation and emotional labour. Silence, in this sense, functions less as the ultimate weapon and more as the necessary space within which genuine peace eventually has room to develop. This means anyone hoping to eventually reach the kind of authentic peace being described throughout this exploration shouldn't skip past silence, assuming it's simply a lesser, less effective strategy compared to the peace that follows it. Silence creates the space. Peace fills that space, eventually, with something genuinely new, something that doesn't require ongoing vigilance or management the way the original relationship did. Both stages matter, and rushing toward peace without first allowing genuine distance and disengagement tends to produce something that looks like peace on the surface, while still secretly remaining tethered to the old relationship's unresolved dynamics underneath. It's worth addressing directly several other tactics people commonly believe might produce this same destabilizing effect, because understanding why these alternatives fall short helps clarify exactly what makes genuine peace so uniquely powerful by comparison. One common alternative involves deliberately displaying evidence of moving on quickly, entering a new relationship visibly and publicly, hoping the avoidant will witness this and experience jealousy or regret. This tactic, whatever its surface appeal, tends to produce something closer to the reaction silence produces, rather than the reaction genuine peace produces, because it remains fundamentally oriented toward the avoidant, designed with their reaction in mind. And avoidants, as already discussed, tend to be unusually skilled at detecting this kind of performance, particularly when it's transparently aimed at provoking a specific emotional response. Even when this kind of display isn't consciously performed for the avoidant's benefit, its timing and visibility often betray an underlying orientation toward being witnessed, toward mattering enough to provoke jealousy, which, ironically, still confirms the exact fear of insignificance this entire exploration has identified as the core avoidant anxiety. Provoking jealousy still centers the avoidant as someone whose reaction matters enough to be worth provoking. It doesn't remove them from the story, It simply changes the specific emotion they're being invited to feel within it. Another commonly attempted tactic involves confrontation, delivering a final, pointed message designed to articulate exactly how the avoidance behaviour caused harm, hoping the clarity and force of that confrontation will finally produce the reckoning that silence alone hasn't managed to trigger. This tactic, while sometimes genuinely cathartic for the person delivering it, tends to produce a similar effect to anger more broadly, keeping the avoidant relationally centered, giving them something concrete to defend against, minimize, or intellectualize, all familiar territory for someone well practiced at managing exactly this kind of direct emotional confrontation, without ever having to confront the deeper insecurity underneath it. A further commonly attempted approach involves a kind of prolonged, ambiguous, partial contact, remaining available just enough to keep the avoidant slightly uncertain about where things stand, hoping this uncertainty will eventually produce enough anxiety to motivate a genuine change of heart. This approach tends to backfire more reliably than almost any other strategy discussed here, because it recreates, almost perfectly, the exact dynamic that made the original relationship so unstable in the first place. One person's ambiguous, partial availability, calibrated around managing another person's anxiety and uncertainty. Rather than disrupting the avoidant's usual coping patterns, this approach essentially invites them to continue relying on those same patterns indefinitely, since ambiguous partial contact requires no genuine reckoning at all, simply an ongoing tolerance for uncertainty that avoidants, given enough practice, often become remarkably skilled at managing.